It's a very rainy July 14th, Saturday, here in Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome to Pastor Bob Daily. So Josh on YouTube says, please do a teaching on how to treat food servers. It's something I've only heard once before from a pastor that used to be a waiter. If he had not taught me how to tip, I would not know how disrespectful I was and would probably still be. Well, Josh, this is a great question, and it really leads to a little larger discussion, actually. You know, tipping is something that is very American, mostly. A lot of other countries don't really tip. But here in America, it's basically telling the waiter or waitress that they did a good job or a bad job. The only reason that you wouldn't tip is if a waiter did a bad job, and you tip at least 15%. Now, when you go into a restaurant, you already know that. You already know that whatever the meal costs, that you're going to tip 15% on top of that. Now, I want to give you a little different perspective on this. I used to own a restaurant many, many years ago, in the 70s actually, called Bojo's. And if you ever went into my restaurant, would you leave a note here? I'd like to know that. But a long time ago, in the 70s. And one of the biggest difficulties I had was getting people to work on Sundays. Not because they wanted to go to church, necessarily. And we weren't open during church anyway. But like in the afternoon and the evenings, because they didn't want to wait on Christians. And generally, Christians were very demanding, not very nice people, and they didn't tip. And I always felt really bad about that because I thought, you know, as a Christian, I ought to tip more. I ought to be more pleasant. I ought to be more understanding and less demanding than anyone. But that's kind of the rap that a lot of Christians still have. And I ask people every once in a while who work in the food industry, you know, how do you feel about that? And many times it's the same thing. You know, they feel like, you know, they don't want to wait on Christians because that's basically the way they are. I'm not sure why that is. But we ought to be even better at treating them well. But folks, let's look at the larger perspective here. You know, it's important that we treat everyone around us well. And I've said many times here, and I'm going to say it one more time because I want you to get it. 1 Peter 3:15, be ready at any time to give a quiet and reverent answer to anyone who asks you about the hope you have within you. That's evangelism. I remember there was a lot of Christians that used to leave tracts, you know, get saved tracts, instead of a tip. And there was one tract that many of them would leave, and the front of it says, here is your tip, and it looked like a $10 bill. And you opened it up, and it wasn't. It was just a tract that told you how to get saved. And I used to watch my waiters and waitresses get those tracts and get so angry with them and crumble them up and throw them away, and I don't think the Christians had any idea what they were doing. You see, it's not how much you hand somebody a tract or, you know, how much you preach at them. It's how you live your life in front of them. And that's why in a restaurant like this, or wherever you might be, it's important that you live your life in front of people. And the reason they would become a Christian is because they're watching you. You know, Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. That's a good example. And folks, we need to get this right. You know, if you are calling yourself a Christian and you're full of turmoil and anger and frustration and all of those things, you need to get all that taken care of. No, not just because it's a bad witness, but because it's really unhealthy for you. And remember, Jesus Christ came to set you free, not to put you in bondage, not to spread the bondage around, but to spread a little love around. That's the most important thing. Well, this issue of food servers is just one example of how we treat people. And we really need to do a good job of representing Jesus Christ, but a better job of being the person that people want to ask the questions of. If you're not that person, Do people look at you and say, man, I don't want to be like him or like her? Something wrong with your life. They ought to be asking you the questions. God bless you. Have a great day.